All right, everybody, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome back. Been a while since me and Larry the lawyer's been here. We're going to do something a little based on the stuff we've covered before. We'll go back to elections here in a way, and we're going to kind of go through the Electoral College, which seems like it's been a point of contention ever since it was put into effect. Larry, how are you, man?
Doing fine, thanks. How are you, Chris?
I'm good. So, the Electoral College, what's the idea behind it? Take us back to the, it's formed of. We got that for me.
All right. First of all, for our viewers, we have to realize that the United States is not a democracy, but is a republic. And the difference is a democracy, if you look back into Greek history at Athens, and if you look at some of our county votes and city votes around the country, a democracy is where the people vote on every issue. So every time you need to do something, you have to call a plenum of the citizens of the county or the city or the nation state, and everybody has to vote on it. Now,
I always get aggravated when people say that.
Now, the United States is a republic, and therefore we actually elect people to represent us and pass laws on our behalf. So that's the major difference. Now, one of the major issues of a republic is how do you elect officers? And most officers are elected by general voting of the population, and then that's representatives and now senators, though at one point they were elected by the state legislatures, most mayors, most city council members, but the president is not a direct election. When you vote for a president, you are voting for electors who will elect the president from what's called the Electoral Congress. So basically, when for want of a better word, when the first Constitutional Convention was in effect, they had to make a determination of how to elect the president. At the very first, they wanted to elect the president either through the Congress. Now, the reason
the Congress would vote?
Pardon?
The actual Congress would vote?
The actual Congress would elect the president. I mean, if you look at most parliamentary democracies in Europe, that's how you elect the prime minister. You know, the head of the head party of the parliament would become the prime minister. In England and in France, well, France is a republic. France is a republic with an elected president at this point. But any parliamentary democracy, your prime minister is elected by the parliament. Israel at one point tried to do a national election of the prime minister, and it happened for one or two cycles, and then they went back to parliamentary democracy where the parliament elects the prime minister. So what's the main issue with Congress electing the president? And the main issue is it goes against the separation of powers. It's in effect the legislative branch of the government electing the executive. So there are issues, and these issues again involve separation of powers. It involves a cabal of people can get together and force a president on the country. So and that was actually the Virginia plan that came out, the Virginia plan and the Virginia Compromise, but then that was disregarded. So the next issue was a combination of the Connecticut Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise, and that's when they decided to have an electoral Congress or a group of electors to elect the president. So ultimately, the United States Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, states that each state is to appoint a quantity of electors equal to the state's congressional delegation, which means the amount of members of the House of Representatives plus 2 for the Senate. And the only people who are disqualified at that point would be federal office holders, or obviously people who are not citizens, or at that point, women. So also in there, the electors are to be elected by the state legislatures are to determine the manner to which electors are chosen. At this current state of the Union, 48 of the 50 states mandate that the winner of the plurality of the state's votes shall receive all of the electoral college votes, and that's by certification of votes. So if we're talking about a three-party election, and we normally have 4 to 6 presidential parties, but assuming one person gets 40% of the vote, another person gets 35% of the vote, which would be, and everybody else combines for 25% of the vote, the person who would get 40% of the vote would get all of the state electors in 48 of the 50 states. Now, there are issues with that, which we'll get to in later on, but this
how are they chosen though, Larry? Are they still chosen by the state representatives or legislators? They still pick the electors?
No, that's up to the various states.
But back then they did.
Pardon?
But back then the state legislatures did pick them, correct?
Back then, the state legislatures would have picked all the electors by some degree or other. You actually have to go back to the Federalist Papers, and you have to read Madison and Hamilton's statements because they specifically state that the electors are supposed to be independent. And that's really never been done because the electors basically pledged themselves to elect the candidate or to support the candidate who has the plurality of votes of that state. Now, whether it's selection by the legislature, whether it's selection by the political parties of the state, or any other means, these people are basically bound into their selection. Now, if we go to, and let me find it, when we'll talk about faithless electors, the first really Supreme Court decision was Ray versus Blair, and this was actually in the 1950s. So, it was a 5-2 decision, and it specifically held that the pledges, whether they were contemplated by the initial founding fathers or not, were constitutional. So when you're an elector and the state, however you're elected, says, will you vote for the person who received the plurality of the votes in the state, that is constitutional. And there was a second case later on, actually very recently, called Chiafalo versus Washington, and also the Colorado Department of State versus Blair, which actually says that unfaithful electors can be punished and or replaced for not voting for the plurality. Now, that is not the law in all states. And in most states, there has been no punishment. In fact, the only state where there actually was punishment was in Washington in 2020, and that was a fine of $1,000 for 3 people, and that was upheld in the case that I just mentioned, Chiafalo versus Washington. But looking back to where we're going, so we have, even though the Federalist Papers state that electors should not be forced to vote, it's been held that they basically are forced to do what the state orders them to do or what the party orders them to do. So what happens is they're locked in to the vote, and that vote is then and based on the 12th Amendment, which did some tweaking of the Electoral College, that vote is taken in the state capitol on a certain date of the year, usually sometime in December, and then forwarded to Washington, where it's read and voted on by the Congress on January 6th of each year. And as you all remember,
yeah, that was you said when you said that got me thinking. You said voted on, and we all remember what was going on. So the individual representatives have to vote to approve the Electoral College once the votes are cast.
Correct.
Okay. So what would happen if they didn't accept it?
If it wasn't accepted? Well,
a constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis. Well, let's take a look at what happens. Currently, there are 538 electors, which makes it, which would be 435 members of the House of Representatives, 100 senators, and 3 electors from Washington, D.C. If you notice, and one of the issue is that the Commonwealth, such as Puerto Rico, and the U.S. territories, such as Guam and the Virgin Islands, do not have any members of the Electoral Congress. Now, they can vote in the primaries for the Democratic and the Republican candidates, but those are the rules of the Democratic and the Republican parties. The only non-state that has electoral votes is Washington, D.C., with 3 electoral votes. So, in order to win, to become president and or vice president today, you need an absolute majority of 270 of the electoral votes.